Okay, welcome back to the grounds edition of the Great Lakes School of Turfgrass Science. Definitely a lot of information to chew on this week. We're in session 8, turfgrass disease management, turfgrass insect management. Now, I will, in full disclosure, in the golf edition of the school, we have these separated up into 2 separate weeks because the content can get fairly large and there's a lot to think about. And we spray a lot of fungicides, we spray a lot of insecticides. Certainly in the golf world, we combine it as one session for this. And not to say that we don't deal with disease and insect issues in lawns, we deal with them quite often, but I think we take a little bit of a different approach. So anyway, you all know who I am. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Paul Koch, who gave just a very fascinating lecture on turfgrass disease management. Hopefully everybody had a chance to view that. Paul is a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then we also have my buddy, Dr. Chris Williamson. So Chris was an entomologist at Madison for 10 years, Chris? Or
21 years.
20, yeah. He was there forever. He was there longer than Bucky Badger.
Oh, God.
Now you're dating yourself. I didn't realize you were that old. But, yeah, I guess, crap, it was 10 years. I was at the U of M almost. So 20 years at Madison. So Chris is the resident entomologist with the group, and just a very, very bright mind as far as turfgrass insect pests go. And I think, Chris, you deal a little bit with like Christmas tree insects, I think, tree forms as well. But a lot of brain with these two.
Ornamentals.
Ornamentals, everything. Well, anyway, I just want to, first of all, I want to appreciate Chris and Paul for what you guys do for the Great Lakes Turf School here. Pretty rare to get the level of knowledge that you guys have for the group. So we'll kind of leave that at that. But, not a whole lot of questions that I gathered from the group this week, and that's just fine. In 6 years at the University of Minnesota, I spent a lot of time diagnosing, lawns, and we've got sports turf in the group, and there are a few sod growers in the group here as well. So I'm just going to throw the initial question to Paul and Chris about, compared to your golf work, how much, Chris, you do mostly, R&D and troubleshooting with your current company, PBI Gordon, I believe, how much focus do you have on insect issues in lawns? And I know white grubs and that whole topic has, really given us a run for our money, I suppose. In my area, preventative applications for Japanese white grub, Japanese beetles, are as common as crabgrass preventers almost now. So talk to me about your experience with lawn care and insect issues and what's concerning to you, Chris.
Okay, first and foremost, I got a couple opening remarks. So let's contrast and compare the lawn care industry, the LCO market, to golf. In golf, unequivocally, disease pathogens reign king. They are the most problematic issue that golf course superintendents have to contend with, comparatively to insects and weeds. I'd put weeds third on the list of golf. That's just my opinion. As we move over into the homeowner lawn care market, I'd say weeds are number one and insects are really close second. And then tertiarily speaking, disease pathogens are a minor player comparatively. So you wanted me to focus on lawn care, and that's fine. So in the world for me as an entomologist and in the world of Paul as a plant pathologist, I think Paul would agree with this. The absolute most important thing is to accurately identify the organism that's causing you the problems. That's the very first and foremost thing that we need to do. So like I remember in my lecture, I talked, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So the more, first of all, you identify accurately what organism you're contending with, and the more that you can learn about the biology of that respective organism, the better equipped you will be to implement a management strategy that is effective, whether that be a biological, a cultural, or as we talk about insecticides and fungicides, a chemical control measure to control that particular, or to manage that particular organism. So I think it's very important that we just keep that in focus. Basically know the biology of what you're trying to manage. and accurately identify it. And then that's the very core of where we start. So that being said, in the world of entomology, i.e., insects and ticks and mites and things like that, and spiders, really it's the insects that we're focused on. And in the world of turfgrass insects, it's really the white grubs that are the absolute, unequivocally most important insect pests that we have to contend with. And I don't want to downplay the impact that other insect species can have, like chinch bug can be very detrimental. Sod webworm can be very detrimental. Armyworms, cutworms, there's a whole laundry list of organisms. Ants, even though ants are beneficial organisms, they can be a nuisance, particularly if we switch over to the golf world. But, you get down in the parts of the country where there's fire ants. Well, fire ants are a really big problem. So we don't want to just say ants are all beneficial organisms, because they're not. So, but as it relates to turfgrass insects, I would say white grubs are the most important insect pest. Within that, there are many species of white grubs. Some species aren't found everywhere. Other species are very polyphagous, where we find them in many parts of the country. So once again, that goes all the way back to what I talked about. Accurately ID what species you have. Within the species of white grubs, some are easier to control than others. It's the nature of the beast. That particular species, just like Paul, he's in the world of disease pathogens. Some disease pathogens are pretty easy to control, while others are more problematic and troublesome to control. So we have that. The other thing is, and I made mention this in my lecture, white grubs have 3 larval stages. We have a first instar grub, which is a very small grub. As soon as the eggs hatch, you get first instars. They grow, they develop through a hormonal process called molting. They develop into the second instar. And ultimately, they make it to the third instar. There are only 3 larval stages. The smaller they are, the more vulnerable they are. The smaller they are, the less damage they cause. The bigger they are, the more damage they cause, the more root feeding they do. And the bigger they are, the more they're able to overcome the various types of control measures that we throw at them. Specifically, if we want to talk about insecticides, bigger grubs have these enzymes in their body. They're called mixed functional oxidases. More specifically, and I'm not trying to talk over anybody's head, but they're called P450 enzymes. The big grubs have high levels of these P450 enzymes, so that when you put an insecticide down in the ground and these insects come in contact with it and they feed on it, it doesn't have that great of an effect on them, because these enzymes, what they do is they detoxify that insecticide. But the younger grubs don't have any, the first instar grubs don't have any titer or level of these P450 enzymes. So then when they're exposed to these insecticides, and even some fungicides for that matter, it's detrimental to those young grubs. So it's very important to know the biology. When are these young grubs present? Because that's the opportune time to control these grubs. The bigger they get, the more they feed. The bigger they get, the more difficult they are to control. So it's very important. Just like in Paul's world, he uses fungicides. Most fungicides, not all, are used preventively. They're not used curatively. In the world of entomology, we've gone in the last decade or two with these preventive products. The reason is they're there, available for when those grubs are present, and they are very effective on those young grubs. If we go out curatively, it's a very difficult challenge. It's a tall order to try to control grubs curatively. We can, but just know there are limitations. Just like in Paul's world, go out curatively with some of these fungicide applications, there are some limitations with them.
Hey, it almost sounds like to me like you were a professor at Madison for 21 years. No, just joking around here, guys. But so to throw it to Paul here, and I agree 100%, Chris, with your ranking of the different issues versus golf for lawn care. So I guess the question we'll throw to Paul is, how can that be? How can disease be the #1 pest pressure on golf, but #3 in lawn care? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's primarily the grass species that are different between the two. I mean, there's a lot of obviously a lot of cultural practices that are different between golf and higher cut turfs. But for the most part, I think it's the species that are used. Creeping bent grass is used a lot on golf, and it's just a lot more susceptible to various diseases than bluegrasses or ryegrasses or fescues. So, and we have that data. That data is well established that bent grass is just highly susceptible. But we have to use it in golf because it's what tolerates the low mowings. And diseases are common in higher cut turf. It's just they don't normally rise to a very significant problem. I've been involved in turf grass pathology in some capacity at UW-Madison since 2005, and I've probably, I can probably tell you on one hand the number of times I've recommended a fungicide for a higher cut turf, either a sports turf or a lawn or a sod situation. So. But that doesn't mean there aren't diseases. They're there. They're just not normally rising to the level that we need to implement some sort of problems or some sort of chemical control strategy. So, we can see snow molds are really common in lawn height turf. We can see leaf spots. I mean, we see leaf spots all the time. Rust is another really common disease, especially in sod. That's really become a kind of a little bit of a nastier disease over the last 10 to 15 years in sod. Mostly, I think, due to the varieties that are being grown. The midnight varieties are really highly susceptible to rust. And probably the most difficult to control diseases that we see in higher cut turf are the patch diseases, the root infecting diseases like necrotic ring spot and summer patch. So, a summer patch would be one of the very few diseases that I probably, if you had a high-end situation, like a high-end sports field or something, that'd probably be one of the very few diseases in lawn care that I would recommend a preventative fungicide for, just because by the time you see the symptoms, there's very little you can do about it because the fungus has rotted away the roots. So you can apply a fungicide then once you see the symptoms, but the root system's already rotted away by the fungus. So, but again, for the most part, you might see disease, but it rarely kills the plant. Normally, the environmental conditions change, and then it shifts, and the plants recover. And when we talk about environmental conditions and disease, it's almost always moisture driven. So when we have wet years, we have a lot more disease than when we have dry years. And there's diseases that occur when it's warm and wet. There's diseases that occur when it's cool and wet. But it's really we need moisture. So if we have dry years, like I think back to 2012, we saw very few. 2012 was a drought year. We saw very few diseases in lawns because most lawns are not irrigated, and it was very dry. And most pathogens need moisture to cause disease.
Oh, great stuff, guys. So we had Dr. Patton's lecture last week, Aaron, Dr. Patton from Purdue University, and we kind of talked about lawn care programs, and obviously a pre-emergent in the spring of the year for crabgrass is, one of the big crutches of a lawn care program, and you probably have fall broadleaf weed control in there as well. For Chris and Paul here both, at what point does a fungicide or an insecticide get included in your program in April in Wisconsin, for example, when you're developing a program? Is it not at all? Or, Chris, is it a history of white grubs are enough to tell you that, hey, I need to get on a preventative white grub, type of approach? Because I do know, as you mentioned, if you miss the boat on the white grubs from a preventative standpoint, their second, third instar are fairly large, and the insecticides we have are fairly toxic and not very effective. So at what point do you include these as part of your program from both insecticide, fungicide standpoint?
Well, Sam, I think you nailed it right on the head there. You got that historical perspective of you've seen for 2, 3, maybe 4 consecutive years where you've got a problem with a particular species, particularly like Japanese beetle. And let's just use Madison, Wisconsin as an example. I remember when I first moved there in 1998, which was like a long time ago, I started talking about Japanese beetles and just introducing people to them because I knew they were in Wisconsin. They were up in the Eau Claire area, but it was like people were looking at me like a deer in headlights. Like, why are you talking about Japanese beetle? That's ridiculous. We don't have them here. I said, I realize that. But when they do come here, I always work under the approach of people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. You got to be prepared for when this does manifest itself. So just be educated. And it was astonishing to me for when they first started moving into the area, how everybody's like, they thought this was the plague that was moving in. And I was like, okay, remember, we prepared for this. So consequently, what you just referred to is that historical perspective, very, very imperative that you have that. Now, if you go into an area where you really aren't certain, you're going to have to play a little bit of hedging your bet game in terms of, has there been a problem in this area? If so, what species have been prominent there? For example, you could go up in the central sands part of the state, and maybe even a little bit north up of Wisconsin. I remember they had a big problems up there with a particular species called the May June beetle, which it's a Phylophaga species. And just having a historical perspective, knowledge of that organism, and understanding the biology of it, so that you know when to implement a respective management strategy. Because otherwise, as I alluded to, when these grubs reach the second and particularly the third instar, they're very challenging and difficult to control. So I think it's very important that you have that perspective, and that's all being in tune with everything that's going on, and just being a good steward and manager of the turf grass.
Yeah, I mean, from a disease standpoint, I would never include a preventative fungicide in a lawn care situation unless you have seen significant damage in a previous year. There's no disease that is, when we talk about on the golf side, when we talk about, when are preventative fungicides beneficial and when are curative, you want to use preventative control when it's a disease that you're pretty darn sure you're going to get, and or a disease that's really hard to recover from. Curative applications are effective when it's a disease you're not sure you're going to get, and it's a disease that if you do get it, it's not that hard to recover from. So those are the situations. And in lawn height turf, most of the diseases that we get are not that hard to recover from. So I'm thinking like which can be very severe in golf, in lawn care 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the conditions that spring. Red thread, another disease that's really common, especially on fine fescue, in typically May to June throughout most of the upper Midwest. Again, it comes on when we have some cool, wet weather, but then it goes away within a couple of weeks, and no long-term damage. Again, the one exception that is if you have an outbreak of a patch disease, especially summer patch, that's a situation where if you have a really large outbreak and it's a really high-end site, I'm thinking like a high-end sports turf field, and you really want to control it, preventative applications are really required there for that. And so then the next year you would want to look at putting out 2, maybe 3 preventative applications of a fungicide to target summer patch. And those would typically start, depending on where you're at in the Midwest, those would normally start in mid to late May. And then you would make 1 or 2 reapplications at a 21 to 28 day interval. But again, it's unless you've seen that damage before and you've had it positively diagnosed as summer patch damage, because summer patch can be confused with white grubs, it can be confused with drought, can be confused with a lot of things. So once you have that positive diagnosis, then the next year is when you might want to put something out.
Well, I like that you really hit the positive diagnosis thing, because I just think all too often, and me, I dealt a lot with homeowners, more so than lawn care operators, even to some extent. But the number of homeowners who called me and said, "Oh, my neighbor thinks I might have grubs," so I went and put this treatment down. And it's like, back to Chris's main point, you've got to identify the issue, whether it's an insect or a disease, or at least have some type of history there, because if you're misdiagnosing issues out there, in a sense, you're kind of cheating the homeowner, and you're also, causing some potential harm to the environment too by a misdiagnosis there. Funny enough, I don't know if this hits home with you guys or not, but we talked about it in one of my lectures, but rough bluegrass, poetriv, was the number 1 misdiagnosed issue that I saw here. It's stoloniferous. In the middle of summer, you get sun and heat, and it'll turn brown, and it looks either like summer patch or it looks like white grubs. Yep. And I'm serious. The companies around here will either spray an insecticide or a fungicide. By September, it's recovered on its own anyway, and then the homeowner kind of thinks, wow, glad I had that fungicide, insecticide treatment for, the wrong issues. So just, back to the first lecture, turf ID, try to get well versed with that. But Paul and Chris, you guys both know there are always exceptions to the rule. The one I want to throw up here, just real quick, Paul, it's thrown me for a little bit of a loop the last couple of years, but this Ascochyta, I don't know if it's unfortunate, especially from a lawn care perspective, because it seems like it's a blight, right? It turns your lawns, especially bluegrass, really straw colored. And for some of you, you might light bulb might go off when we're talking about it here. But it seems like the lawns that have a lawn care company with more fertilizer and more water tend to get hit by it worse. But it's pure blight, Paul. Can you speak to Ascochyta?
Yeah, so the reason that an LCO would almost always get a call on it is because it's a tip dieback blight. So we don't have many of these in turf pathology, but the fungus actually enters the cut end of the leaf blade and it kills it back. There's really only one or two other diseases that do that. So it's a tip dieback. So it looks like you sprayed something that was phytotoxic. So you almost always get a call from a client that says, what the hell did you spray? It's killing my turf. It's blighting my turf. And then you can tell if it's Ascochyta. One, you should always send it in for a positive diagnosis. But two, one of the key diagnostic techniques is there are these little kind of black particles, these little black, almost looks like little specks of dirt. But they don't rub off as easily as dirt would on the tip of the leaf blade, on the blighted part of the leaf blade. Again, it needs moisture. So typically during high moisture times, during kind of mild to warm with a lot of moisture. And one of the reasons that you see it on higher maintained lawns is because a lot of times they're irrigating very, so the tracking of the tire tracks, that's another classic Ascochyta symptom. So if you see tracking tire tracks, it's not always Ascochyta, but and what's being tracked there is the spores themselves can be tracked. So that it produces a lot of spores, and if you drive through it, the tire tracks on the mower can actually move the spores around and cause that damage. So yeah, one of the reasons that we see it on higher maintained sites is that those typically are irrigated more regularly and there's just more moisture available. I would argue, with our diagnostic lab, the vast majority of samples that we get from homeowners are actually from homeowners with in-ground irrigation systems. So now whether you can make the argument that these people are just more in tune with what's going on in their lawn because they have an in-ground system, so they care more. But you could also make the argument that these people have an in-ground system and they're just watering too damn much, and they're making an environment that's more suitable for a disease to occur. So, but you're right, Ascochyta has been problematic. We didn't see so much of it last year, 2019, but 2017 and 2018 we saw a lot of Ascochyta, and I think that was mostly surrounding kind of wet periods. Where it's really severe is when we have a really wet period that transition to kind of a hot, dry period. So that transition period is where we typically see a lot of Ascochyta.
Great stuff. Yeah, just a different one that that I've seen more often now. But anyway, so Chris, so last week with Dr. Patton, we actually had the glyphosate conversation, right? And had the discussion of kind of how to talk about it with your clients who you're getting questions from. And, the EPA just came out with pretty good studies saying it's not carcinogenic, at all and that type of thing. But, there's nowhere else in this school where we educate the participants on this whole pollinator issue. So I don't know if this is the right time to kind of bring up that whole discussion. And I don't even know if you can have a 5-minute chat about that, Chris. I know you've been involved pretty heavily with some of the publications that are out there and available, with being sure we're not part of the problem. But can we cover the pollinator decline issue in a few minutes? And give some general recommendations about how to be sure you're not part of the problem?
I'll say this. We cannot adequately cover it in the amount of time. But that being said, those publications that are out there from the North Central Region Integrated Pest Management Office, I happen to be a co-author on some publications. Those are really, and I'm not saying it because I'm one of the authors, but They are a really good resource for showing and demonstrating how to be a good steward of these products and how we can use them in concert with pollinators. I'm a beekeeper myself, so I raise honeybees. I know they're not the only pollinator, but I'm very mindful of products like that as well. So I try to practice good stewardship with these products. So as a real quick, simple, down and dirty example, if you've got a home lawn that for whatever reason you're treating it for grubs, for example, and it happens to have white clover in it that's flowering, don't make an insecticide application to that lawn until the homeowner mows off the white clover flowers. Then you can come in and make the application of the insecticide and then water it in appropriately and adequately. And you're going to completely mitigate any potential harm that could happen to any pollinators. But if you go in and you make the application to a lawn that's got those flowers on it, then you are making that particular property subject to that insecticide application for pollinators. So there's some very simple things that we can do. We need to be really good stewards of these products so that we can minimize the potential negative or adverse impact that we would have on these pollinators. So without, we could have a whole lecture just on that. So that's it in a nutshell. So if we just need to be good stewards with these products, use them wisely, and follow some really basic best management practices. And once again, that there's a couple publications out there from the North Central Region IPM website, which is, I think they're great. And I think you got that. I gave you that link, did I? If I didn't, I can get it to you.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking back at what we posted. We did post those up in the supplemental resources as well. So no, you can't really give it justice here, but
no.
As you know, Chris, Dr. Marla Spivak gave a TED talk, I think, and she's world-renowned bee researcher here at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's just, if you have time and you want to look up that TED talk, Marla Spivak, but her first slides showed the vegetable and fruit aisle with pollinators at the grocery store, and the second slide showed the implications of having no pollinators and not getting that fruit and vegetables. So
30% of our food resources are tied right to pollinators. Right
okay.
up. Yep.
30%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and can we also ask the question of, be smarter about when you're making the applications, but how safe are some of the alternative type of products? I know the economics don't always make sense, choosing a Celiprin over Merit, for example, but that help me out on the active ingredient, chlorantraniliprole.
Yep, chlorantraniliprole. Yep, that's the active ingredient in the Celiprin. It is bee friendly. There's no doubt about it because it doesn't have a bee box on the label. You will rarely see other insecticides that don't have a bee box on the label. And not to throw Dr. Koch under the bus, but it's a matter of time before you'll see bee boxes on the fungicide labels because many of those fungicides are very efficacious against our pollinators. So we need to be mindful of that too. So yeah, that's one unique characteristic of a Celiprin, chlorantraniliprole, that makes it unique. And it's a great product. It from a cost perspective, it's measurably, it costs more. Definitely.
Sure. Okay. Well, so what I'm hearing from both of you guys, Chris, to make an insecticide application, you've got to have the history, or you have to see what kind of Paul talked about in his lecture, direct signs of that particular insect, which is easy in the entomology world, right? It's a grub or it's a chinch bug or it's there, and has it hit my threshold level, and should we treat for that, right? Mm-hmm. From a disease standpoint, there's a little bit more of a gray area, Paul, I suppose. And as you mentioned, you very rarely have made a recommendation for fungicides, for home lawns. But I guess the question that I have is, if I'm dealing with issues and I don't know how to get my answer solved, I think it opens up a discussion about the turf diagnostic lab, potentially, Paul, and then Chris, from an entomology standpoint. I don't know what the options are as far as getting an insect issue diagnosed. Is that just your
University of Wisconsin has one of the best insect diagnosticians in the country. PJ Leash runs that, and he's outstanding. Paul could probably do a better job of providing the information. Or you probably have a link to his website on your website. I suspect. Well, I don't know.
Full disclosure, I don't know much about it, Chris. Can I send him a turf sample? Like I send
for free. It doesn't charge. It's free.
But I don't need to be mailing him an insect in a bag necessarily.
No, but if he has a website just like Paul does, and he can tell you exactly how to prepare that sample to be sent in, so he doesn't get just a bunch of broken legs and a head capsule laying around somewhere.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he is an insect diagnostician, so he's not going to really look. I mean, you can send him like plant samples, but I think PJ's office is around the corner from mine, and he's a former student of Dr. Williamson's. And Chris is right; he's spectacular, but he's really identifying insects themselves. So you don't really want to send a sample that you're not sure what's going on, and it might be insects, and send that to PJ. I mean, he'll look at it, but it's not really what his lab is designed to do. So if it's something where you're not quite sure what the problem is, it might be insects, it might be disease, it might be something else, might be something abiotic. That's a sample you would send to the TDL. And then if we get a sample in and we think it's an insect, we can run it down to PJ. But if you have an insect, like you see insects in your turf or wherever, you can then package them up, look at the website, and you can send those insects into PJ, and he will diagnose them. And he's one of the best in the country, in the world, at doing it. And as Chris mentioned, it's free.
Could probably even just take a nice picture and email it to him.
Oh, yeah. And many pictures. You can. Yeah, but thanks for that clarification. So, as Paul alluded to, if you've got damage to the turf, don't be sending that to him. But if you've got the actual culprit, yes. Or take a picture, send it to him. As long as it's good resolution. Yeah.
How about Turf Diagnostic Lab, Paul?
Yeah, so we look at any turf issue that you got. It's my program oversees it. Kurt Hockemeyer is the manager of that program. I used to manage it before I became a professor, and it's one of the very few turf grass specific diagnostic labs in the country. So we're turf guys, and we're also plant pathologists. So we're doing the diagnosing. We know what to look for in turf problems. We know how to talk about recovering from those turf issues. So it's $20 a sample. All of our information on how to submit a sample is at tdl.wisc.edu. And if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Kurt.
Great stuff, guys. I just wanted to verify here real quick that there weren't any questions that came in on the forum. Nope, we look pretty good there. So I think unless you guys, for Paul and Chris, unless you had anything else you wanted to bring up here, go ahead, Paul.
One closing comment related to, just kind of circling back to the glyphosate, and I don't know if Dr. Patton brought it up, but my favorite resource that I point turfgrass managers to, because we get a ton of questions with this glyphosate stuff. My favorite resource that I point people to is the National Pesticide Information Center, NPIC. It's a collaboration between the EPA and Oregon State University, and they have a ton of fact sheets that they have kind of not just for glyphosate, but they have them for 2,4-D. They have them for a bunch of different pesticides, and some of their fact sheets are designed to give to the layperson, the public. And other ones are more technical and they have a lot more scientific information. But it's all science-based information. It takes out all the scare tactics and all that sort of stuff. And it's just really great information. So I always point people when they need information to give to clientele about glyphosate or other pesticide usage and talking about it in a science-based, reasonable manner to point people towards that NPIC website.
And I'll post that. I just found the link here. I'll post that on the website here.
It's a great website. Ton of resources on there.
Okay. Anything else, guys? Well, being pathologists, entomologists, any comments on the coronavirus or anything like that at all? Go stock up. No, that's a different day. Okay. Sounds good. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for giving your comments on. And for the students in the class, if you're viewing this as a recording, we definitely have access to Dr. Cope, Dr. Williamson as well. They'd be more than happy to answer what questions you have from both of their lectures. I know it was a lot to chew on, so definitely 3 hours or more of lecture this week. And for those of you viewing it, a lot of new information, I'm sure, as well. Next week is a break week, so we'll be off next week. So hopefully you can use that time to kind of catch up. The quiz should be open and available now. And then the following week, we're actually on the topic of kind of mathematics and calibration, again, with Dr. Aaron Patton, who does just a really fascinating, as fascinating as you can get on calibration and mathematics, I suppose.
But very important.
Yes, very, very important. So we'll leave it at that, gang. As always, email me questions. And if you have questions specifically for Dr. Williamson or Dr. Koch, we can get them onto them as well. So just want to say thanks to Chris and Paul for joining me tonight. And always great seeing the two of you. So we'll see you on the golf edition next week for sure anyway. So signing off for another Wednesday night here at the Great Lakes Turf School.